When Madison Sterling dialed 911 that night, she thought she was reporting one moment of domestic violence. Her billionaire husband had grabbed her pregnant belly and yanked her hair in their $50 million mansion. But that single phone call would uncover something far more sinister than she ever imagined. Blake Sterling wasn't just an abusive husband. He was the mastermind of a $400 million criminal conspiracy that had been destroying her sanity for years. The woman he tried to erase would become the instrument of his complete destruction. This is the true story of how one terrified phone call brought down an empire built on lies, manipulation, and stolen millions. The 911 call came from the marble kitchen of a $50 million Malibu mansion at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night. Madison Sterling, 8 months pregnant and trembling, whispered into her phone while her husband Blake paced like a caged animal behind her. 911. What's your emergency? My husband just grabbed my hair and shoved me, Madison said, her voice surprisingly steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. I'm pregnant and I need help. Blake's perfectly manicured hand had left red marks on her scalp where he'd yanked her auburn hair back, forcing her to look at him while he explained why she was wrong, why she was dramatic, why she needed his guidance. The same hand that signed $100 million deals had just reminded her who really controlled her life. But this wasn't the worst part of Madison's story. This wasn't even the middle. This was just the beginning of discovering what her husband was truly capable of. Ma'am, officers are on the way. Stay on the line with me. Madison watched Blake transform before her eyes. The rage melted away, replaced by his famous charm that had graced magazine covers and TED Talk stages. Blake Sterling, the tech mogul who'd revolutionized artificial intelligence, who employed thousands and donated millions to charity. The man who'd swept her off her feet 3 years ago when she was a rising investment banker and he was the client everyone wanted. Madison, honey, Blake said, his voice suddenly gentle and concerned. You're having pregnancy hormones. You know how emotional you get. Just hang up the phone and we'll talk about this. The operator's voice crackled through the speaker. Ma'am, are you safe right now? Madison looked around their designer kitchen with its imported Italian marble and custom cabinets that cost more than most people's houses. She looked at Blake, impeccably dressed even at midnight, his dark hair perfectly styled, his expression now radiating wounded concern rather than the cold fury she'd seen moments before. I don't know, she whispered. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, red and blue lights began painting their pristine white walls. Blake's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something that made Madison's blood freeze. Not anger this time. Calculation. You have no idea what you've just done, he said quietly. The police arrived within minutes. Detective Sarah Mitchell, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and 20 years of domestic violence experience, stepped into their foyer and immediately noticed what most people missed. Not the obvious wealth or the picture-perfect couple, but the way Madison unconsciously positioned herself near the exit and how Blake's hand rested possessively on her lower back even as he smiled and offered coffee. Mrs. Sterling, we received a domestic violence call from this address. Are you injured? Madison touched her scalp where Blake had grabbed her hair. He pulled my hair and pushed me twice. I hit the counter with my hip. She lifted her silk nightgown slightly, revealing a dark bruise already forming. Blake stepped forward with practiced charm. Officer, I'm Blake Sterling. I think there's been a misunderstanding. My wife is 8 months pregnant and her emotions have been quite volatile lately. I was simply trying to calm her down when she became hysterical. Detective Mitchell had heard this speech before. She photographed Madison's injuries while Blake paced and made phone calls to what he called his legal team, but she also noticed other things. The way Madison flinched when Blake moved too quickly, The expensive security system with cameras everywhere except the kitchen, the way Blake answered questions directed at his wife. Mrs. Sterling, Detective Mitchell said gently, "Do you feel safe staying here tonight?" Madison looked at their multi-million-dollar home, at Blake, who was already spinning the narrative to make her seem unstable, at the life that had slowly transformed from dream to nightmare without her even noticing. "No," she said simply. "I don't." Blake was arrested that night on domestic violence charges. As the handcuffs clicked into place, he looked at Madison with an expression she'd never seen before. Not rage, not charm, but something far more terrifying. A promise. 5 years of marriage, Madison, 5 years of giving you everything. You'll never survive without me. You are nothing without me. Madison watched the police car disappear into the night, carrying her husband away. She should have felt relief, victory, safety. Instead, she felt like she just declared war on someone who'd been planning this battle far longer than she'd realized. Madison discovered the frozen bank accounts at 7 a.m. the next morning when she tried to buy prenatal vitamins at the pharmacy. The card reader blinked, declined 3 times before the teenage cashier awkwardly suggested she try another form of payment. Standing in line behind other customers going about their ordinary Wednesday morning routines, Madison felt her world tilt sideways. She tried her backup credit card. Declined. Her personal checking account. Declined. The joint savings account that should have contained over $200,000. Access denied. "I'm sorry," the cashier mumbled. "Maybe call your bank." Madison stepped aside, her hands shaking as she dialed customer service. The automated system cheerfully informed her that all accounts bearing her name had been frozen pending resolution of legal proceedings initiated by the primary account holder, Richard Blake Sterling. She drove home in Blake's spare Tesla, the only car she had access to since her Range Rover was registered in his name. The mansion felt different in daylight, bigger and emptier, like a museum where she was both the curator and the main exhibit. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "Madison, this is Crystal Vaughn from Sterling Industries. Blake asked me to help coordinate your needs during this difficult time. I'm here to support you however I can." Madison remembered Crystal vaguely, Blake's stunning business partner, the woman who'd helped build his AI empire and stood beside him at every major industry event. Tall, blonde, brilliant, and according to Blake, completely devoted to the company's success. Crystal arrived within an hour, carrying coffee and pastries from Madison's favorite bakery downtown. She wore a designer suit that probably cost more than most people's rent and moved through Blake's house with the confidence of someone completely at home. "I brought breakfast," Crystal said, settling into the kitchen where the confrontation had happened just hours before. "Blake told me what happened. I'm so sorry you're going through this." Madison accepted the coffee gratefully. She hadn't eaten since yesterday and felt lightheaded from stress and pregnancy exhaustion. "The bank accounts are frozen," Madison said. "All of them. I can't even buy groceries." Crystal nodded sympathetically. Blake mentioned that might happen. It's standard procedure when there are legal complications. Unfortunately, but don't worry. I can help with immediate expenses while you sort things out. For the first time in hours, Madison felt a flicker of hope. Crystal was successful, independent, someone who understood business and legal complexities. Maybe she wasn't as alone as Blake wanted her to believe. "There's something else," Crystal continued, pulling out a tablet. "Blake's legal team is very concerned about the police report. They've been researching your background, and they've found some things that might be problematic for your case." Madison's stomach clenched. "What kind of things?" "Medical records from your college years. Some therapy sessions after your father died. A few prescriptions for anxiety medication? Crystal's voice remained gentle, but Madison caught something else underneath. Blake's lawyers are suggesting that pregnancy hormones might have exacerbated some underlying mental health issues. The coffee turned bitter in Madison's mouth. That's ridiculous. I haven't taken anxiety medication in over 5 years. Those therapy sessions were grief counseling after my dad's heart attack. I know, sweetie. And I believe you completely. But Blake's team is very good at constructing narratives. Crystal leaned forward, her expression genuinely concerned. They're also suggesting that your call to 911 might have been influenced by hormonal instability rather than actual danger. Madison felt the walls of Blake's trap beginning to close around her. He hadn't just grabbed her hair on impulse. He'd been building a case for her instability for months, maybe years. Crystal, I need to ask you something directly. Whose side are you on? Crystal's blue eyes met hers without hesitation. Yours, Madison. Blake is my business partner, but what he did to you was wrong. No one deserves to be hurt, especially not while pregnant. Madison wanted to believe her. Crystal was the only person offering help, the only one who seemed to understand the complexity of her situation. There's more, Crystal said quietly. Blake's mother called this morning. Sophia Sterling wants to meet with you. Madison's blood chilled. Sophia Sterling was legendary in tech circles, a 70-year-old venture capitalist who'd built the family fortune before Blake was even born. She controlled trusts worth hundreds of millions and had a reputation for destroying anyone who threatened her family's interests. What does she want? To discuss your future, apparently, and the babies. Crystal's expression grew troubled. Madison, I need to be honest with you. The Sterling family has resources you can't imagine. If they decide you're a threat to their reputation or Blake's career, they won't hesitate to destroy you completely. Madison placed her hands protectively over her swollen belly. Her daughter kicked as if sensing her mother's fear. What are you saying? I'm saying that maybe, just maybe, there's a way to resolve this quietly. Blake made a mistake, but he's not a monster. He's under tremendous pressure with the new AI launch and the IPO preparations. Sometimes successful men crack under stress. Madison stared at Crystal, recognition slowly dawning. You're asking me to take him back. I'm asking you to consider your options carefully. Blake is willing to get counseling, to make changes. You'd have access to the best therapists, the best doctors for the baby, financial security for life. Crystal's voice grew urgent. But if you continue down this legal path, if you try to destroy him publicly, the Sterling family will use every resource to prove you're an unfit mother. They'll take your daughter, Madison. They'll take everything. Madison felt the trap snap shut around her. Blake hadn't just grabbed her hair. He'd grabbed her entire future and twisted it into a weapon pointed at her heart. I need time to think, Madison whispered. Crystal nodded and gathered her things. Of course, but don't take too long. Blake's arraignment is tomorrow morning, and after that, the situation becomes much more complicated. After Crystal left, Madison sat alone in Blake's mansion, surrounded by millions of dollars worth of art and furniture that now felt like evidence of her own imprisonment. She'd thought calling 911 would save her. Instead, it had awakened something far more dangerous than her husband's anger. It had awakened his strategy. Madison's water broke at 3 a.m. on Thursday morning, 6 weeks earlier than her due date. The stress of the past 48 hours had sent her body into premature labor, and as contractions ripped through her, she realized she was completely alone in Blake's fortress of a house. She called 911 again, this time as an ambulance patient rather than a domestic violence victim, But even through the haze of early labor, she noticed things that didn't feel right. The paramedics knew exactly where Blake kept his medical power of attorney documents. They asked specific questions about her recent emotional episode and whether she'd been taking any medications for anxiety or depression. "I'm not taking anything," Madison gasped between contractions. "Just prenatal vitamins." The paramedic, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, made notes on his tablet. "Ma'am, we have documentation here that you've been prescribed anxiety medication by Dr. Richard Hoffman. Are you sure you're not currently taking anything?" Madison's contraction peaked, stealing her breath and her ability to argue. She'd never heard of Dr. Richard Hoffman. She'd never been prescribed anxiety medication during her pregnancy. But somehow, somewhere, medical records existed claiming otherwise. At Malibu General Hospital, things moved quickly. Too quickly. Madison was whisked into a private delivery room where a team of doctors and nurses seemed to know exactly what to expect. Dr. Sarah Chen, the attending physician, spoke in hushed tones about maternal stress complications and concerns about postpartum stability. "Mrs. Sterling, we're going to take excellent care of you and your baby," Dr. Chen said as nurses prepared IV medications. "Your husband's medical team has briefed us on your recent difficulties." "What medical team?" Madison tried to focus through the pain and confusion. "Blake was arrested. He's not my medical team." Dr. Chen exchanged glances with the nurses. "Mrs. Sterling, you're under tremendous stress right now. Let's focus on delivering your baby safely, and we'll worry about other complications afterward." Madison's daughter Emma was born at 6:47 a.m., weighing 4 pounds and 12 ounces but healthy despite her early arrival. For one perfect moment, holding her tiny daughter against her chest, Madison forgot about frozen bank accounts and legal traps and medical conspiracies. Emma was perfect, with dark hair like Madison's and tiny fingers that gripped with surprising strength. "She's beautiful," Madison whispered, tears streaming down her face. "She's perfect." But the perfect moment lasted only minutes. "Mrs. Sterling," Dr. Chen said gently, "due to some concerns about your recent psychological evaluation, we need to have Emma examined by our pediatric specialists. It's purely precautionary." Madison's arms tightened around her daughter instinctively. "What psychological evaluation? I haven't had any psychological evaluation." A nurse with sympathetic eyes reached for Emma. "Ma'am, let's not upset yourself right now. Your baby needs some tests, and you need rest. This is all very standard for high-risk deliveries." They took Emma before Madison could protest further. Through her exhaustion and post-delivery haze, Madison realized that somehow, in the space of 48 hours, she'd been transformed from victim to patient, from protective mother to potential threat. Her phone had been buzzing constantly. Blake's legal team, Crystal with updates, numbers she didn't recognize. But when she tried to call her sister Jessica in Portland, the call went straight to voicemail. "Jess, it's Madison. Emma was born this morning. She's beautiful, but they won't let me hold her. Something's wrong. Blake has done something. Please call me back." The return call came within an hour, but it wasn't the support Madison expected. "Madison, I got your message." Jessica's voice was strained, careful. "I also got some very concerning information from Blake's family." Madison's heart sank. "What kind of information?" "Medical records, Madison, psychiatric evaluations showing you've been having paranoid episodes and emotional breakdowns, video footage of you destroying property in your house, evidence that you've been having an affair and the baby might not even be Blake's." Madison felt like she'd been punched. "None of that is true. Jessica, you know me. You know I would never—" "Do I Jessica's voice cracked. Madison, I haven't really talked to you in over a year. Every time I called, Blake said you were busy or tired or not feeling well. When I invited you for Christmas, he said your doctor recommended avoiding travel stress. Madison realized with growing horror how completely Blake had isolated her from everyone who might have noticed the gradual changes in her behavior, her freedom, her autonomy. The footage they showed me, Madison, it looks like you throwing dishes and screaming about Blake monitoring you. You looked unwell, dangerous, even. It's fake, Madison whispered. Or manipulated. Blake has security cameras everywhere. He could have edited anything to look like anything. I want to believe you, Jessica said, and Madison could hear tears in her voice. But they also have sworn statements from your neighbors about hearing you screaming threats at Blake, from your housekeeper about finding broken objects and evidence of drug use. Madison's world tilted completely off its axis. Drug use, Jessica. I'm pregnant. I haven't even had a glass of wine in 9 months. I don't know what to believe anymore. Blake's lawyers say you need help, not legal support. They say the best thing for you and the baby would be voluntary commitment to get the treatment you need. The call ended with Jessica promising to think about everything, and Madison staring at her phone in stunned silence. Blake hadn't just been planning her destruction for days or weeks. He'd been building this trap for months, maybe years, systematically creating evidence of her instability while isolating her from anyone who might question the narrative. Dr. Chen returned with more news that made Madison's blood turn to ice. Mrs. Sterling, I'm afraid there are some complications with Emma's release, given the circumstances of your recent arrest. Blake was arrested, not me. Given the domestic violence situation and concerns about your mental health stability, Child Protective Services needs to conduct an evaluation before Emma can go home with you. Madison tried to sit up, ignoring the post-delivery pain. What are you saying? I'm saying Emma will remain in our care while CPS determines the safest placement for her. This could take several days, possibly longer. Madison stared at the doctor, understanding finally dawning. Blake hadn't just grabbed her hair in anger. He'd grabbed her entire life and systematically demolished it while she wasn't looking. The medical records, the witness statements, the evidence of drug use, all of it carefully constructed to support one inevitable conclusion. Madison Sterling was an unfit mother, and Blake Sterling was the concerned husband trying to protect his child from his wife's dangerous instability. As Dr. Chen left, Madison lay alone in her hospital bed, her daughter taken away, her family turned against her, her resources frozen, and her reputation destroyed. For the first time since this began, Madison understood the true scope of what she was fighting. This wasn't about domestic violence or even divorce. This was about the complete annihilation of her existence as an autonomous human being. Blake Sterling intended to erase her entirely. Madison's salvation arrived in the form of Hunter Cross, a high-profile divorce attorney with a reputation for protecting wealthy women from predatory husbands. He appeared at her hospital room door Friday morning carrying expensive coffee and a leather briefcase that screamed competence and discretion. Mrs. Sterling, I'm Hunter Cross. I represent women in situations exactly like yours. Hunter was everything Madison needed him to be, tall, confident, with silver hair and kind eyes that suggested both strength and empathy. He settled into the uncomfortable hospital chair as if it were his corner office and spread legal documents across her bedside table with practiced efficiency. Crystal Vaughn contacted me, Hunter explained. She's very concerned about how Blake's legal team is handling your case, the medical records they're using, the witness statements. She thinks something isn't right. Madison felt her first real spark of hope in days. You believe me that it's all fake. I believe you're in a carefully constructed trap, Hunter said carefully. And I believe we can get you out of it. But first, we need to discuss Emma. Madison's heart clenched. They won't let me see her. The doctors say CPS has to evaluate everything first. Hunter nodded grimly. Blake filed an emergency custody motion yesterday. He's claiming you're mentally unstable and potentially dangerous to the child. He has medical documentation going back months showing your deteriorating psychological state. Documentation from doctors I've never seen for conditions I don't have. Exactly. Which is why we're going to fight this systematically. Hunter pulled out a yellow legal pad. First, we'll demand independent psychological evaluation by doctors with no connection to Blake or his family. Second, we'll subpoena the original security footage from your house to check for tampering. Third, we'll investigate the timeline of these medical records to prove they were fabricated. For the first time since calling 911, Madison felt like someone was actually listening to her, actually believing her, actually fighting for her. Hunter, can you really get Emma back? Madison, I've been handling high-asset divorces for 20 years. I've seen men try to destroy their wives in every way imaginable, but I've never seen evidence fabricated quite this extensively or this skillfully. Hunter's expression grew troubled. Blake Sterling is either the most manipulative sociopath I've ever encountered, or what? Or he's had professional help creating this trap, the kind of help that costs serious money and requires serious connections. Madison thought about Sophia Sterling, Blake's mother, with her hundreds of millions and her reputation for destroying threats to the family empire. His mother? Possibly. But Madison, here's what I need you to understand. Fighting the Sterling family means fighting people with unlimited resources and no scruples about using them. Are you prepared for that? Madison looked out her hospital window at the parking lot where normal people went about their normal lives, unaware that someone could simply decide to erase another person's entire existence and have the power to do it. I don't have a choice. They have my daughter. Hunter smiled for the first time. Good, because we're going to war. Over the next 3 hours, Hunter outlined their strategy with military precision. They would file motions challenging every piece of evidence Blake's team had presented. They would demand forensic analysis of the security footage and medical records. They would subpoena Blake's financial records to trace payments to any doctors or witnesses who might have been bought. There's one more thing, Hunter said as he packed up his briefcase. I want you to stay away from Crystal Vaughn for now. Madison was surprised. Why, she's the one who called you. Because in cases this complex, sometimes the person offering help is actually the person setting the trap. I'm not saying Crystal is working against you, but I'm saying we can't trust anyone connected to Blake until we know exactly what we're dealing with. After Hunter left, Madison felt energized for the first time in days. She had a plan, she had representation, and she had someone who believed her story and understood the stakes. Her phone buzzed with a text from Crystal. How did the meeting with Hunter go? I'm so glad I could connect you two. He's exactly what you need right now. Madison hesitated, remembering Hunter's warning. But Crystal had been her only ally when everyone else abandoned her. She texted back, "Good meeting. Thank you for everything you're doing to help." The response came immediately. Of course, we women have to stick together. Blake made a terrible mistake, and you deserve justice. Hunter will make sure you get it. Saturday morning brought news that made Madison's cautious optimism explode into genuine hope. Hunter called with an update that changed everything. Madison, we caught them. The security footage from your house has been edited. My tech expert found digital fingerprints proving the video was manipulated to make you appear unstable. We also found payments from a Sterling Industries account to Dr. Richard Hoffman, the doctor who supposedly treated you for anxiety." Madison sat up in her hospital bed, energy surging through her. "So we can prove it's all fake. We can prove Blake's team fabricated evidence. That should be enough to get Emma back and get the domestic violence charges taken seriously." Hunter's voice was jubilant. "Madison, I think we've got him. Blake Sterling is about to learn that money and influence can't overcome hard evidence of fraud and perjury." For 24 hours, Madison allowed herself to believe she was winning. Hunter filed emergency motions. The judge agreed to an expedited hearing. Crystal sent supportive texts promising that justice would prevail. Sunday evening, Hunter called with news that shattered Madison's world completely. "Madison, I need you to sit down. Something's happened." Madison was already sitting, but she gripped the phone tighter. "What is it?" "The evidence is gone. All of it. My tech expert's computer was hacked last night. The servers where we stored the forensic analysis of the security footage were wiped. The financial records showing payments to fake doctors have disappeared." Madison felt cold spreading through her chest. "How is that possible? Professional level cyber attack, military grade, the kind of thing that requires resources and expertise that most private individuals don't have access to." Hunter's voice was shaky. "Madison, there's more. My office was broken into last night. Nothing was stolen, but all of our files related to your case are gone." Madison understood with crystal clarity what had happened. Blake hadn't just been one step ahead of them. He'd been watching every move they made, anticipating every strategy they employed, and systematically destroying their ability to fight him. "Hunter, what does this mean for Emma?" The silence stretched too long. Madison, without evidence to challenge Blake's claims, and with the original security footage now supporting his narrative about your instability, "I'm not sure we can win the custody hearing." Madison stared at the hospital room wall, understanding that her brief moment of hope had been another carefully constructed trap. Blake had let her think she was winning just long enough to identify all of her weapons and neutralize them. "There's something else," Hunter said quietly. "I've been thinking about how quickly they responded to our investigation, how precisely they knew what evidence to destroy." "Madison, I think someone on our side has been feeding information to Blake's team." Madison's blood turned to ice as she realized what Hunter was suggesting. Someone she trusted, someone with access to their legal strategy, someone who knew exactly what evidence they'd found and where it was stored. "You think it's Crystal?" "I think," Hunter said carefully, "that Crystal Vaughn might not be the ally she appears to be." Madison hung up and stared at her phone, scrolling back through Crystal's supportive text messages. Messages that had arrived at very convenient times. Messages that had encouraged her to trust Hunter completely and share all their legal strategies. Her phone buzzed with another text from Crystal. "I heard about the setback with the evidence. Don't worry, we'll find another way. Blake can't hide the truth forever." Madison stared at the message, understanding finally dawning. Crystal had known about the setback before Madison had even told anyone outside of Hunter's team. Crystal Vaughn hadn't been helping Madison fight Blake Sterling. Crystal Vaughn had been helping Blake Sterling destroy Madison's every attempt to save herself and her daughter. The person Madison had trusted most had been her greatest enemy all along. Madison confronted Crystal Monday morning in the hospital cafeteria, choosing a public space where cameras and witnesses might provide some protection. Crystal arrived looking perfectly put together as always, carrying coffee and wearing an expression of concerned support that Madison now recognized as masterful acting. "Madison, sweetie, I'm so sorry about what happened with the evidence. Hunter told me it was a professional job." Crystal settled into the plastic chair across from Madison, her voice warm with sympathy. But don't worry. We'll find another way to prove Blake fabricated everything. Madison studied Crystal's face, looking for cracks in the performance. How did you know about the evidence being destroyed before I told you? Crystal's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. Hunter called me last night. He thought you might need emotional support when you heard the news. Hunter doesn't have your number. I never gave it to him. Now Crystal hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Blake gave it to him months ago, back when we were all working together on the IPO preparations. Hunter and Blake go way back. Madison felt pieces clicking into place. Hunter and Blake know each other. From college, I think. But Madison, that doesn't matter now. Hunter is completely on your side. Madison's phone buzzed. A text from Hunter, emergency meeting at my office, new evidence that changes everything. Come immediately. Madison showed the text to Crystal, watching her reaction carefully. Crystal's face lit up with hope that looked genuine, but Madison now recognized as calculated. Oh my God, Madison. Maybe they found backup files or something. You should go right now. Madison stood up, but instead of heading toward the elevator, she walked to the hospital security desk. I need to report suspicious activity in my room. Someone has been accessing my phone and my conversations without permission. The security guard, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes, listened carefully as Madison explained her situation. Ma'am, if you're concerned about surveillance, we can move you to a different room and restrict access to your medical information. Crystal approached, looking confused. Madison, what are you doing? Hunter is waiting for you. Call Hunter, Madison said to the security guard. Ask him if he sent me a text about emergency evidence 5 minutes ago. The security guard dialed the number from Madison's phone. After a brief conversation, she hung up, looking troubled. Ma'am, Attorney Cross says he didn't send any text messages today and he's not at his office. He's actually in court all morning on another case. Crystal's perfect mask finally slipped. For just a moment, Madison saw something cold and calculating behind the concerned friend performance. Madison, there must be some confusion. The confusion, Madison interrupted, is thinking you were helping me instead of helping Blake destroy me? Crystal gathered her purse and stood up, the warm sympathy dropping away entirely. Madison, you're clearly having another episode. The stress of separation from Emma is affecting your judgment. But Madison wasn't the same woman who'd been manipulated and gaslit for months. Hospital security was watching now. Witnesses were present. Crystal couldn't simply rewrite reality anymore. Tell me about Derek Mason, Madison said quietly. Crystal went completely still. I don't know what you're talking about. My ex-fiancé Derek, the FBI investigator who supposedly committed suicide after obsessing over me. Except I called his partner this morning. Derek is alive. Crystal. He's in witness protection after uncovering financial crimes at Sterling Industries. The color drained from Crystal's face. She looked around the cafeteria, calculating escape routes and witness positions like the predator she'd always been. You're having a psychotic break. Madison, everyone can see that. Madison smiled for the first time in weeks. The beautiful thing about paranoia, Crystal, is sometimes people really are out to get you. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you figure it out before they finish destroying you. Crystal moved toward the exit. But Madison wasn't done. One more thing. Emma's DNA results came back this morning. Blake demanded paternity testing to question whether she was his child. Remember, except the results show something interesting. Emma's blood type proves Blake can't be her biological father. Crystal froze completely. Which means, Madison continued, either I had an affair Blake somehow never discovered despite monitoring my every movement, Or someone tampered with the DNA samples to create evidence of infidelity. Someone with access to the hospital, to the lab results, to the chain of custody. Crystal turned around slowly, her expression now completely transformed. Gone was any pretense of friendship or concern. What looked back at Madison was cold, intelligent malice. "You have no idea what you're up against," Crystal said quietly. "Blake and I have been planning this for 2 years. Every doctor who treated you, every witness who saw you acting unstable, every piece of evidence showing your mental breakdown, we created all of it. The beautiful part is that by the time we're done, you'll actually believe you're crazy." Madison felt vindicated terror. She'd been right about the conspiracy, but learning the scope of it was overwhelming. Why destroy me so completely?" Crystal's smile was razor sharp. "Because you were never the target, Madison. You were just the weapon. Blake's mother, Sophia, controls the family trusts. She's been looking for a reason to remove Blake from power for years. A domestic violence scandal that destroys his reputation and proves he's unfit to run the company would give her exactly what she needs." Madison's mind reeled. "You're working for Sophia Sterling." "I'm working for the highest bidder. Sophia Sterling paid me $5 million to seduce Blake, gather evidence of his weaknesses, and then destroy him publicly. Ruining you was just collateral damage." The pieces fell into place with horrifying clarity. Crystal hadn't been Blake's business partner falling in love with him. She'd been a professional destroyer, hired by his own mother to eliminate him as competition for control of the family empire. "But you fell in love with him," Madison realized. "That wasn't part of the plan." For the first time, Crystal's mask cracked completely. "Blake Sterling is brilliant and charming and completely immoral. He's exactly the kind of man I was trained to destroy and exactly the kind of man I can't resist. So I changed the plan. Instead of destroying Blake, you decided to destroy me and help him keep everything. Instead of destroying Blake, I decided to marry him after his divorce and run the empire together. Sophia Sterling can die knowing her son chose his business partner over his family legacy." Madison understood the final piece of the puzzle. "Emma. You needed Emma gone, so Blake would have no ties to me, no reason to pay child support or maintain any connection." Crystal nodded approvingly. "You're not as stupid as Blake thought you were. Too bad it won't help you now." Security cameras had recorded everything. Hospital staff had witnessed Crystal's confession, but Madison realized it didn't matter. Crystal and Blake had built their trap too perfectly. "The confession doesn't help me, does it? Because I'm the mentally unstable woman having paranoid delusions, and anything I say will just prove how sick I am." Crystal's smile returned. "Now you're learning how the game is really played. Blake will be so disappointed that his wife's condition deteriorated to the point where she's having elaborate conspiracy fantasies. He'll have no choice but to commit you for intensive psychiatric treatment." Madison watched Crystal walk away, understanding that she'd won a battle but was about to lose the war. She knew the truth now, but the truth had been weaponized against her so effectively that knowing it only made her seem more delusional. Her phone buzzed with a text from Blake. "Madison, Crystal told me about your episode at the hospital. I'm worried about you. I think it's time we discussed intensive treatment options." Madison looked around the hospital cafeteria, at the normal people living normal lives, unaware that reality itself could be manipulated by people with enough money and malice. She had one last card to play. One person who might believe her and help her fight back. It was time to call Derek Mason. Derek Mason answered his phone on the second ring, and hearing his voice nearly broke Madison's composure completely. For 3 years, she'd believed her ex-fiancé was dead, another casualty of Blake's systematic destruction of her life. Learning he was alive felt like discovering oxygen after drowning. Madison Jesus, I've been trying to reach you for months. Are you safe? Madison was calling from a secure phone in the hospital chapel, the only place she could find without security cameras. Derek, they told me you committed suicide. Blake's people showed Jessica a suicide note claiming you were obsessed with me. Derek's laugh was bitter. Blake Sterling's people are very creative with paperwork. Madison, I'm in federal witness protection. I've been building a case against Sterling Industries for financial fraud, money laundering, and about 12 other federal crimes. Crystal Vaughn just confessed that she and Blake have been systematically destroying my life to cover up their own crimes. Crystal Vaughn isn't who you think she is, Derek said grimly. Her real name is Christina Vale. She's a professional corporate infiltrator. Companies hire her to seduce executives, gather insider information, and then destroy them when it becomes profitable. Madison sank onto a chapel pew, overwhelmed by the scope of the deception. She told me Sophia Sterling hired her to destroy Blake, but then she fell in love with him and switched sides. Sophia Sterling is dead. Madison. The world stopped spinning. What? She died 8 months ago. Heart attack at her estate in Switzerland. But her death was never announced publicly because it would have triggered automatic inheritance clauses that Blake wasn't ready to execute. Madison's mind raced through implications. So Crystal isn't working for Sophia Sterling because Sophia Sterling is dead, which means Crystal and Blake have been using Sophia's death as cover to loot the family trusts while making it look like they're fighting each other. Derek's voice was tight with anger. Madison, they've stolen over $400 million while creating this elaborate drama to explain why the money is disappearing. Madison understood the final piece of Blake's plan. They needed a public scandal to explain the missing money. A messy divorce, custody battle, and mental health crisis would provide perfect cover for massive legal fees and settlement payments that would actually be going straight into their pockets. You were never the target or the weapon. Madison, you were the cover story. Madison felt sick. Emma. They took Emma to make the story more believable. And to give Blake leverage over you permanently. As long as he has your daughter, you can't expose them without destroying your own credibility. Madison was quiet for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what she was up against. Blake and Crystal hadn't just stolen her life. They'd stolen hundreds of millions of dollars and constructed an elaborate theater production with Madison as the unwilling star, designed to cover their massive financial crimes. Derek, what can we do? How do we fight people who can literally rewrite reality? We use their overconfidence against them. Blake and Crystal think they've thought of everything, but they've made one crucial mistake. What mistake? They assumed I was actually dead. I've been working with the FBI for 8 months, gathering evidence of their financial crimes, but I couldn't move against them while you and Emma were in danger. Now that they've made their play and shown their full hand, we can spring our trap. Madison felt hope stirring for the first time in days. What kind of trap? The kind that uses their own weapons against them. Madison, how would you feel about wearing a wire and getting Blake to confess to everything? Madison thought about her daughter, somewhere in the system being cared for by strangers while her father and his accomplice planned to destroy her mother's sanity and steal hundreds of millions of dollars. I'll do whatever it takes to get Emma back and put them in prison where they belong. Good. Because Blake Sterling is about to learn that some people are much more dangerous than he realized when they have nothing left to lose. Derek outlined the FBI's plan over the next hour. Madison would be released from the hospital and appear to suffer a complete mental breakdown, becoming erratic and paranoid in ways that would make Blake feel safe approaching her directly. She would seem to accept his offer of intensive psychiatric treatment, giving him an opportunity to confess his plans while she wore recording equipment. The beautiful thing, Derek explained, is that Blake's greatest weakness is his ego. He won't be able to resist explaining exactly how brilliant his plan was once he thinks you're completely defeated. Madison understood the risks. If Blake suspected she was recording him, or if the FBI's plan failed, she would lose Emma permanently and probably spend years in psychiatric facilities while Blake and Crystal enjoyed their stolen fortune. Derek, what if this doesn't work? Then we'll find another way. Madison, I've been watching Blake destroy you for 3 years, unable to do anything because blowing my cover would have made things worse for both of us. I'm not going to let him win now. Madison hung up and walked back through the hospital corridors, passing doctors and nurses who looked at her with a mixture of sympathy and professional concern. Soon she would have to perform complete mental collapse convincingly enough to fool people who specialized in recognizing genuine psychological distress. But for the first time since calling 911 6 days ago, Madison felt like she was playing offense instead of defense. Blake Sterling had made one fatal error in his elaborate plan to destroy her life and steal his family's fortune. He'd forgotten that the woman he married was a former investment banker who'd built her career on analyzing complex financial schemes and identifying fraud. Madison Sterling might be trapped, isolated, and systematically destroyed, but she wasn't stupid, and she was about to show Blake and Crystal exactly how expensive their mistake was going to be. Her phone buzzed with a text from Blake. Madison, I've arranged for Dr. Patricia Winters to evaluate you tomorrow. She's the best psychiatric specialist on the West Coast. I just want to help you get better. Madison smiled as she typed her response. Thank you for caring about me. Blake, I'm ready to get the help I need. The game was about to begin. Madison's breakdown began Tuesday morning in the hospital lobby, where she'd arranged to meet Blake for her transfer to Dr. Patricia Winters' private psychiatric facility. She'd spent all night researching symptoms of postpartum psychosis and practicing the kind of erratic behavior that would convince Blake she was completely defeated. Blake arrived looking every inch the concerned husband, expensive suit, worried expression, gentle voice full of practiced compassion. He'd brought Crystal with him for emotional support. And Madison had to suppress her fury at seeing the woman who'd systematically destroyed her life now playing the role of sympathetic friend. Madison, sweetheart, you look terrible, Blake said, taking her arm gently. Have you been sleeping at all? Madison had spent the night deliberately staying awake, refusing the hospital's sleep medication and practicing the hollow-eyed, twitchy demeanor of someone losing their grip on reality. I can't sleep. They watch me through the cameras. They listen to everything I say. Blake and Crystal exchanged meaningful glances, exactly the reaction Madison wanted. They thought her paranoia about surveillance was delusional, unaware that she'd actually discovered their extensive monitoring operation. Who watches you, honey? Blake asked with perfect concern. Madison looked around the lobby wildly, letting her voice rise just enough to attract attention from other visitors. The nurses, the doctors, they all work for you, don't they? They tell you everything I say and do. Madison, nobody is spying on you. You're sick, but we're going to get you help. The FBI wire taped to her chest felt impossibly obvious, but Blake showed no signs of suspicion. Madison let herself tremble slightly as they walked toward his car. Where's Emma? I want to see Emma. Emma is safe, sweetheart. She's being cared for while you get better. Once you're healthy again, you can spend time with her. Madison grabbed Blake's arm with what she hoped looked like desperate hope rather than calculated manipulation. Really? If I get treatment, I can have Emma back. Of course, Madison, I never wanted to keep you from your daughter. I just want to make sure you're stable enough to care for her safely. They drove to Dr. Winter's facility in Blake's Tesla, Madison sitting in the passenger seat performing increasingly erratic behavior while the hidden recording equipment captured every word. Crystal sat in the back seat, occasionally offering supportive comments that would sound caring to anyone who didn't know she was one of Madison's primary destroyers. "Blake," Madison said suddenly, staring out the window at traffic. "Do you remember when we got married, you said you'd always protect me?" Blake's hand found hers, his touch gentle and reassuring. "I am protecting you, Madison. This is the only way to help you get better. But the things I remember, the fighting, the control, the way you grabbed my hair, was any of that real?" Blake's grip tightened almost imperceptibly. "Madison, your memories have been affected by your illness. The stress of pregnancy, the hormonal changes, the isolation you felt, they've made you remember things differently than they actually happened." Madison turned to look at him directly. "So you never hurt me?" "I would never hurt you, sweetheart. The Madison I fell in love with was strong and brilliant and independent. I want to help you find that woman again." Madison felt sick hearing him lie so smoothly, but she forced herself to continue the performance. "What if I can't get better? What if the doctors can't fix what's wrong with me?" Blake pulled into the parking lot of Dr. Winter's facility, an elegant building that looked more like a luxury resort than a psychiatric hospital. "Madison, you're going to get better because you're going to have the best care money can buy. Dr. Winters specializes in cases exactly like yours." As they walked toward the building, Madison played her final card. "Blake, I'm scared. What if people find out about my breakdown? What if it affects your business?" Blake stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression shifting subtly. For just a moment, Madison saw calculation behind the concern. "Madison, you don't need to worry about my business. In fact, your illness has actually provided some opportunities." Crystal shot Blake a warning look, but he was warming to his subject now, unable to resist explaining his brilliance to someone he believed was no longer capable of understanding or threatening him. "What kind of opportunities?" Madison asked innocently. "Well, legal proceedings related to your treatment have required significant financial restructuring, moving assets, creating trusts, managing inheritance issues. It's actually been quite beneficial for long-term planning." Madison let confusion show on her face. "I don't understand." Blake smiled indulgently. "Of course you don't, sweetheart. It's very complicated business stuff. The important thing is that everything is being handled properly." They were inside the facility now, walking through marble hallways lined with expensive art. Dr. Winters appeared, a distinguished woman in her 60s with kind eyes that Madison immediately distrusted. "Mrs. Sterling, I'm Dr. Patricia Winters. We're going to take excellent care of you." Madison shook hands while studying the doctor's face. "Dr. Winters, Blake says you specialize in cases like mine. How many other wives of billionaires have you treated for postpartum psychosis?" Dr. Winters exchanged glances with Blake. "Every case is unique, Mrs. Sterling, but I've worked with many families dealing with similar stresses." Madison nodded and allowed herself to be led into a consultation room where the real performance would begin. The FBI wire continued recording as Blake grew more comfortable and confident, gradually revealing details of his financial machinations while explaining to Madison why her treatment would need to be extensive and long-term. "The trust restructuring alone will take months to complete," Blake said, settling into a leather chair. "And of course, your condition provides legal justification for all the associated expenses." Madison tilted her head with confused curiosity. What expenses? Medical costs, legal fees, security arrangements, asset protection measures. When someone is as ill as you are. Madison, protecting the family's financial interests becomes quite complex and expensive. Crystal had been silent through most of this conversation, but now she leaned forward. Blake, maybe we shouldn't discuss business details while Madison is so fragile. But Blake was enjoying himself too much to stop now. Crystal, Madison deserves to understand what's happening. After all, her illness is the reason we've been able to implement so many beneficial changes. Madison felt the trap closing around Blake as his ego overrode his caution. What kind of changes? Inheritance restructuring, international asset transfers, corporate reorganization. Your breakdown has provided perfect legal cover for financial strategies that might otherwise have attracted unwanted attention. Dr. Winters cleared her throat. Mr. Sterling, perhaps we should focus on Mrs. Sterling's treatment plan rather than business matters. Madison saw Blake's irritation flash across his face. He didn't like being interrupted when he was explaining his brilliance. Of course, Dr. Winters. Madison, the important thing is that you get better, regardless of how long it takes or how much it costs. Money is no object when it comes to your health. Madison smiled gratefully while calculating exactly how much evidence the FBI now had of Blake's financial fraud. You're so good to me. Blake, I don't know what I'd do without you. You'll never have to find out. Sweetheart, I'll always take care of you. Madison nodded and let Dr. Winters begin explaining the treatment program while the recording equipment captured every detail of the elaborate psychiatric imprisonment Blake had arranged for her. But inside, Madison was counting down the minutes until Derek and the FBI would have enough evidence to destroy Blake's life as completely and systematically as he'd tried to destroy hers. The performance was almost over, and Madison Sterling was about to take her final bow. The FBI moved at dawn on Wednesday morning, coordinated raids hitting Sterling Industries, Blake's mansion, Crystal's apartment, and Dr. Winters' facility simultaneously. Madison watched through her window as federal agents swarmed the psychiatric hospital where she'd spent exactly one night, their black SUVs and tactical gear creating a scene that looked like something from a movie. Derek Mason appeared in her doorway at 6:15 a.m., no longer hiding his identity or his involvement in her case. Behind him stood Agent Sarah Rodriguez, the federal prosecutor who'd been building the case against Blake for almost a year. Madison, it's over. We got everything. Madison had slept for the first time in a week, knowing that by morning, Blake Sterling's carefully constructed world would be collapsing around him. What did the recordings show? Agent Rodriguez pulled out a tablet showing transcripts of yesterday's conversations. Fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, falsification of medical records, kidnapping, and about 8 other federal crimes. Blake and Crystal confessed to stealing over $400 million while you were wearing a wire. Derek sat on the edge of Madison's hospital bed, his expression mixing relief and anger. Blake's ego destroyed him completely. He couldn't resist explaining exactly how brilliant his plan was to someone he thought was too crazy to understand or remember. Madison felt vindicated exhaustion. What happens now? Now Blake and Crystal are in federal custody, facing charges that will put them away for decades. Dr. Winters is cooperating with investigators in exchange for reduced charges. And Emma is being released to your custody within the hour. Madison's eyes filled with tears for the first time since this nightmare began. I can have my daughter back. Agent Rodriguez smiled. Mrs. Sterling, based on our investigation, you are clearly a fit and loving mother who was systematically victimized by an elaborate criminal conspiracy. Emma will be released to your care immediately, and CPS is dropping all involvement in your case. Derek pulled out another document. There's more. Blake's financial crimes triggered automatic forfeiture of stolen assets. Madison, you're about to become very wealthy. Madison looked at the asset forfeiture paperwork, seeing numbers that made her head spin. The money Blake and Crystal had stolen using her breakdown as cover would be returned to Sophia Sterling's estate, with Madison as the primary beneficiary since she was Blake's legal wife when the crimes were committed. "I don't want his money," Madison said quietly. "I just want Emma and our freedom." "You can do whatever you want with it," Agent Rodriguez said. "But Madison, that money represents justice. Blake Sterling used his wealth as a weapon against you. Now that same wealth can become a tool for helping other women escape similar situations." The next few hours blurred together in a series of legal procedures, medical clearances, and paperwork that officially restored Madison's life to her control. The fake medical records were expunged. The fraudulent witness statements were exposed. The manipulated security footage was corrected. Emma was returned to Madison's arms at 10:30 a.m., healthy and beautiful, and completely unaware that her first week of life had been spent as a pawn in her father's criminal enterprise. Madison held her daughter and cried tears of relief, exhaustion, and overwhelming love. Derek stayed close through all the procedures, and Madison realized that seeing him again had awakened feelings she'd thought were buried forever. "Derek, I need to ask you something. When Blake's people faked your suicide, did part of you hope I might grieve for you?" Derek looked uncomfortable. "Madison, you were married to someone else. I was trying to protect you, not manipulate your emotions. But did you hope?" Derek was quiet for a long moment. "I hoped you'd remember that someone had loved you for who you really were, not who they wanted you to become. I hoped someday you'd realize you deserved better than Blake Sterling." Madison shifted Emma to her other arm and looked at Derek directly. "I'm going to be a single mother with more money than I know what to do with, and probably years of therapy ahead of me to recover from what Blake did to my mind and my sense of reality." "I know. And you're an FBI agent who works dangerous cases and travels constantly, and probably has commitment issues after watching how badly marriage can go wrong." Derek smiled slightly. "Probably." Madison smiled back. "Want to figure it out together?" Derek's answer was interrupted by Agent Rodriguez returning with final paperwork and news about Blake's arraignment. "Mrs. Sterling, Blake Sterling has been denied bail. He's considered a flight risk and a danger to witnesses. His trial is scheduled to begin in 6 months." Madison nodded, feeling closure she hadn't expected. "Will I have to testify?" "You'll probably be the prosecution's key witness. Blake's defense team will try to claim you were actually mentally unstable and your recordings aren't reliable, but the financial evidence corroborates everything you captured on tape." Derek squeezed Madison's hand. "Madison, are you ready to face Blake in court and tell the world exactly what he did to you?" Madison looked down at Emma, sleeping peacefully in her arms, then around the hospital room where just days ago she'd been trapped and powerless and convinced she was losing her sanity. "I'm ready to make sure Blake Sterling never has the power to destroy another woman's life the way he tried to destroy mine." Agent Rodriguez gathered her files. "Mrs. Sterling, one more thing. We found evidence that Blake has done this before. At least 3 other women over the past decade. Your willingness to fight him publicly will help them get justice too." Madison felt the final pieces of her healing fall into place. Blake hadn't chosen her randomly or destroyed her impulsively. She'd been the latest victim in a pattern of systematic abuse that he'd perfected through practice on other women. But unlike his previous victims, Madison had resources, allies, and most importantly, a daughter worth fighting for. "Agent Rodriguez, I'll testify." I'll tell my story as many times as necessary to make sure Blake Sterling and Crystal Vaughn face consequences for every woman they've hurt. As the federal agents left and Derek went to handle discharge paperwork, Madison sat alone with Emma in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the hospital window. Outside, normal people were going about their normal lives, unaware that justice sometimes required ordinary women to find extraordinary courage. Madison had called 911 6 days ago to protect her unborn daughter from one moment of violence. She'd ended up exposing a criminal conspiracy worth hundreds of millions of dollars and saving other women from Blake's systematic destruction. "Emma," she whispered to her sleeping daughter, "your mama learned something important this week. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to let someone convince you that you're powerless." Emma stirred slightly, her tiny hand gripping Madison's finger with surprising strength. Madison smiled, understanding that they were both exactly where they belonged, safe, free, and ready to build the life that Blake Sterling had tried to steal from them. The federal courthouse in downtown Los Angeles looked like a fortress on the morning of Blake Sterling's trial, surrounded by news vans and protesters holding signs reading, "Justice for Madison and Believe Survivors." Madison walked up the courthouse steps, holding Emma, now 6 months old, and babbling happily at the cameras flashing around them. Derek walked beside her, his hand steady on her back, as reporters shouted questions about her testimony and Blake's defense strategy. They'd spent months preparing for this moment, working with prosecutors to build an airtight case while Madison slowly healed from the psychological damage Blake had inflicted. The courtroom was packed with journalists, legal observers, and other women who'd come forward with their own stories about Blake's pattern of abuse. Monica Stevens sat in the front row, the ex-girlfriend whose testimony had helped establish Blake's history of violence. Dr. Martinez, Madison's former therapist, waited nearby to testify about the situational anxiety Madison had experienced while married to Blake. Blake sat at the defendant's table, looking smaller than Madison remembered, his famous charm replaced by the hollow expression of someone whose carefully constructed world had completely collapsed. Crystal sat at a separate table with her own legal team, having negotiated a plea deal in exchange for testifying against Blake. Judge Patricia Chen called the court to order, and prosecutor James Wright began his opening statement by playing the recording Madison had made at Dr. Winter's facility. Blake's voice filled the courtroom. "Your breakdown has provided perfect legal cover for financial strategies that might otherwise have attracted unwanted attention. Your illness is the reason we've been able to implement so many beneficial changes." Madison watched the jury's faces as they heard Blake casually explaining how he'd used her fabricated mental illness to steal millions of dollars. Their expressions ranged from disgust to outrage to simple disbelief that someone could be so coldly calculating about destroying another person's life. Wright continued his opening by outlining the scope of Blake's crimes. "Ladies and gentlemen, you will hear evidence that Blake Sterling didn't just commit domestic violence against his pregnant wife. He orchestrated an elaborate criminal conspiracy involving medical fraud, financial theft, witness tampering, and systematic psychological abuse designed to drive Madison Sterling insane while stealing over $400 million from his deceased mother's estate." Blake's defense attorney, David Martinez, tried to salvage his client's case by arguing that Madison had indeed been mentally unstable and that Blake's actions were motivated by genuine concern for her welfare and their daughter's safety. "My client is a successful businessman who made mistakes in trying to help his wife deal with serious mental health issues," Martinez argued. "The recordings you'll hear show a man trying to provide expensive psychiatric care for a woman he loved, not a criminal mastermind." But when Madison took the witness stand that afternoon, her calm, articulate testimony demolished Blake's defense completely. "Mr. Sterling systematically isolated me from my family and friends over a period of 3 years, Madison testified, looking directly at the jury. He controlled our finances so completely that I received a $300 monthly allowance for household expenses while he spent thousands on luxury items for himself. He installed tracking software on my phone and monitored my location 15 times per day on average. Wright led Madison through the timeline of Blake's escalating control, from the early romantic gestures like wanting to know where she was at all times, to the gradual elimination of her independence, to the final assault that triggered her 911 call. Mrs. Sterling, when you called 911 that night, did you believe you were in danger? I believed my husband was capable of seriously hurting me and my unborn daughter. His grip on my hair was hard enough to pull strands loose from my scalp. His expression when he realized I was calling for help was the most frightening thing I'd ever seen. What happened after Mr. Sterling was arrested? Madison's voice remained steady as she described discovering the frozen bank accounts, the fabricated medical records, and the systematic destruction of evidence that might have helped her case. I realized that the assault wasn't an impulsive act of violence. It was part of an elaborate plan to destroy my credibility, take my daughter, and steal millions of dollars while using my supposed mental illness as legal justification. Wright played more recordings, including Crystal's confession in the hospital cafeteria about being hired to destroy Blake but deciding to partner with him instead. Mrs. Sterling, how did you feel when you learned that Crystal Vaughn, the woman you trusted to help you, was actually working to destroy you? Madison looked at Crystal, who was staring at the defendant's table and refusing to make eye contact. I felt like reality itself had been weaponized against me. When someone can hire professionals to gaslight you, manipulate your medical care, and turn your own support system against you, you start to question everything you think you know about your own life. On cross-examination, Blake's lawyer tried to paint Madison as vindictive and unstable, but she'd spent 6 months in therapy specifically preparing for this moment. Mrs. Sterling, isn't it true that you've profited significantly from your accusations against my client? I've received assets that were stolen from Mr. Sterling's deceased mother's estate using my fabricated mental illness as cover. Those assets were returned to their rightful place through federal asset forfeiture proceedings. Haven't you used your story to gain sympathy and financial advantage? Madison smiled slightly. Mr. Martinez, I've used my story to expose criminal activity and help other women recognize the warning signs of financial and psychological abuse. If that's brought me advantages, they're advantages I earned by surviving your client's attempts to destroy me. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned with guilty verdicts on all counts, Blake Sterling finally showed genuine emotion for the first time in the trial. Not remorse or regret, but rage at being outmaneuvered by the woman he'd tried to erase. Judge Chen sentenced Blake to 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. Crystal received 12 years under her plea agreement, outside the courthouse. Madison gave a brief statement to the media while Emma played with Derek's FBI badge. I called 911 that night to protect my daughter from one moment of violence. I never imagined it would lead to exposing a criminal conspiracy worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But I've learned that sometimes the most ordinary act of self-defense can have extraordinary consequences. A reporter shouted a question about her future plans. I'm going to raise my daughter and use Blake's stolen money to help other women escape situations like mine. The Madison Sterling Foundation will provide legal aid, safe housing, and financial support for domestic violence survivors. Derek stepped forward. Mrs. Sterling has shown incredible courage in fighting for justice not just for herself, but for every woman Blake Sterling victimized over the past decade. Her testimony has already helped 3 other women come forward with their own cases. As they walked away from the courthouse, Emma babbling happily and Derek carrying the diaper bag, Madison realized that Blake's attempt to destroy her life had actually given her something invaluable, absolute clarity about what mattered and what didn't. Blake Sterling had grabbed her hair in anger one night and set in motion the complete destruction of his own carefully constructed empire. Madison Sterling had called 911 in terror and discovered strength she never knew she possessed. The woman Blake had tried to erase had become the instrument of his own destruction. And that, Madison thought as she kissed Emma's forehead, was the most perfect justice of all. 1 year after Blake's sentencing, Madison stood in the conference room of the Madison Sterling Foundation, looking out at the Pacific Ocean while reviewing applications from women seeking help escaping abusive relationships. Emma, now walking and chattering constantly, played with toys in the corner while Madison worked. The foundation occupied the top floor of a renovated building in Santa Monica, far from the Malibu mansion where her nightmare had begun. Madison had sold Blake's house and used the proceeds to fund safe housing for domestic violence survivors. The opulent prison where she'd been trapped was now helping other women find freedom. Derek knocked on the open door, carrying coffee and wearing the casual clothes he preferred when he wasn't working federal cases. "The documentary crew is here for your final interview." Madison nodded, straightening her simple dress. The documentary about her case had been in production for months, following her story from the 911 call through Blake's trial and the foundation's launch. The filmmakers hoped it would help other women recognize the warning signs of financial and psychological abuse before it escalated to physical violence. "Madison, are you ready for this?" Derek asked, settling Emma on his lap. Over the past year, he'd become the father Emma had never had, patient and loving and completely different from the man who donated his DNA to create her. "I think so. It feels strange, turning the worst experience of my life into something that might help other people." "That's what survivors do," Derek said quietly. "They transform their pain into purpose." The documentary crew set up in Madison's office, cameras positioned to capture both her face and the ocean view behind her. The director, Sarah Kim, had spent months earning Madison's trust and learning the complexities of her story. "Madison, can you tell us about the night you called 911? Madison looked directly into the camera, thinking about all the women who might be watching and wondering if they were living in situations similar to her marriage to Blake. "I called 911 because my husband grabbed my hair and I was afraid he might seriously hurt me or my unborn daughter. I thought I was reporting one incident of domestic violence. I had no idea I was actually uncovering a criminal conspiracy worth hundreds of millions of dollars. What do you want other women to know about recognizing financial and psychological abuse?" Madison chose her words carefully, thinking about the universal dilemmas that made women vulnerable to predators like Blake. The scariest thing about psychological abuse is how gradually it happens. Blake didn't start our relationship by tracking my location and controlling my finances. He started by being incredibly attentive and interested in every detail of my life. He started by insisting on taking care of everything so I wouldn't have to worry about bills or decisions or planning. She paused, looking at Emma, who was showing Derek her favorite book about strong women throughout history. "At what point does love become control? At what point does protection become imprisonment?" Those are questions every woman in a relationship should ask herself regularly, because the people who want to hurt us are very good at making it feel like love. What would you tell a woman who's watching this and recognizing her own relationship in your story? Madison leaned forward slightly, speaking directly to the camera as if addressing one specific woman who needed to hear her words. "I would tell her, that she's stronger than she thinks she is, and that help is available if she's ready to accept it. I would tell her that leaving someone who claims to love you but actually wants to control you is one of the hardest things she'll ever do, but also one of the most important. What about the financial aspects of leaving an abusive relationship? Financial abuse is designed to make you feel trapped and dependent. Blake made sure I couldn't survive without him, or at least that's what I believed. But there are resources available: legal aid, safe housing, job training, childcare assistance. The practical barriers to leaving are real, but they're not insurmountable if you have the right support. Sarah Kim asked the final question that Madison had been preparing for throughout the interview. Madison, do you ever regret calling 911 that night? Madison was quiet for a long moment, thinking about everything that had followed that phone call. The terror and isolation and systematic destruction of her sense of reality. The separation from Emma and the months of legal battles and psychological recovery. The media attention and public scrutiny and reliving her trauma in courtrooms and interviews. But she also thought about the 3 other women who'd come forward after Blake's conviction, finally able to seek justice for their own experiences with his abuse. She thought about the Foundation's clients, women who'd found safety and resources and hope after years of believing escape was impossible. She thought about Emma, who would grow up knowing that her mother had chosen courage over comfort when it mattered most. No, Madison said firmly. I will never regret choosing my daughter's safety over my own fear. I will never regret exposing Blake's crimes or helping other women recognize the warning signs of abuse. Calling 911 that night was the best decision I ever made, even though I couldn't know it at the time. After the documentary crew left, Madison and Derek took Emma to the beach, watching their daughter play in the sand while the sun set over the Pacific. Emma had no memory of her first chaotic week of life or the father who'd tried to use her as a weapon against her mother. She would grow up knowing only love and safety and the kind of relationship Madison had learned to recognize and demand. Derek, Madison said as Emma chased seagulls along the water's edge, do you ever wonder what our life would have been like if I'd never married Blake? Derek was quiet for a moment. Sometimes, but Madison, I think you needed to experience Blake's version of love to recognize the real thing when you found it again. And Emma wouldn't exist without that marriage, even though it nearly destroyed you. Madison watched her daughter, fearless and joyful and completely secure in being loved unconditionally. You're right. Everything that happened led us here, to this beach, to this family we've built together. Her phone buzzed with a text from Janet Rodriguez, one of the Foundation's first clients who'd left her abusive husband 6 months ago and was now starting nursing school. Madison, I got the scholarship starting classes in January. Thank you for helping me believe I could do this. Madison smiled and showed the message to Derek. This is why we do the work. This is why you survived Blake Sterling, Derek corrected, so you could help other women survive their own versions of him. As they walked back to the car, Emma between them holding both their hands, Madison thought about the woman she'd been when Blake first grabbed her hair in their marble kitchen. Terrified, isolated, convinced she was powerless to change her situation. That woman had made one split-second decision to dial 3 numbers on her phone. Those 3 numbers had changed everything. Madison Sterling had learned that sometimes the most ordinary act of courage, asking for help when you need it, can have extraordinary consequences. Sometimes the person trying to destroy you gives you exactly the tools you need to destroy them instead. And sometimes, when you refuse to let someone convince you that you're powerless, you discover that you're actually more powerful than you ever imagined. Emma squealed with laughter as Derek swung her up onto his shoulders. And Madison realized that Blake Sterling's greatest mistake hadn't been grabbing her hair or stealing millions of dollars or constructing elaborate criminal conspiracies. His greatest mistake had been underestimating the woman he'd married, and that mistake had cost him everything while giving Madison exactly the life she'd always deserved but never dared to believe was possible. If this story of courage and justice inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button. It really helps more people discover these powerful stories. Drop a comment below sharing your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe with notifications on so you never miss our latest true crime content. Your engagement helps us continue bringing you these incredible stories of survival and triumph. Thank you for being part of our community.